I remember the exact moment the world shifted beneath my feet. It was a Tuesday, the kind of dreary, overcast day that perfectly matched the storm brewing inside me. My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 58 years, I believed I understood my family, my legacy, and the man I called my brother. I was wrong. Horribly, tragically wrong. Everything I thought I knew about our so-called family fortune, the one passed down through generations of Vances, was a lie. A meticulously crafted deception orchestrated by the very person I trusted most. What I'm about to reveal isn't just a story of betrayal, it's a raw emotional journey into the heart of a family torn apart by greed and secrets. If you've ever felt the sting of a broken promise, or the crushing weight of a loved one's deceit, then you'll understand the fire that ignited within me. This isn't some fictional drama you watch on a streaming service. This is my life. A life shattered and then painstakingly rebuilt through a relentless pursuit of truth. For years, my brother Arthur had been the golden boy. The one who handled the family's investments, the one who spoke with such authority about our inheritance, always with that reassuring smile. He was the protector, the shrewd businessman, the pillar of our legacy. I looked up to him, relied on him, and in my heart, truly loved him. That love, however, was a blindfold, carefully placed by Arthur himself. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every comforting word he uttered about our shared future was a performance, a masterful act of manipulation designed to keep me in the dark. The first crack in his facade appeared subtly, a whisper of doubt from an old family friend, a retired accountant named Martha. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that some of the numbers Arthur presented didn't quite add up. My initial reaction was defensive. How dare she question Arthur? He was family. But Martha's words, like a tiny splinter, began to irritate, to fester. They sparked a resentment in me, a slow burn against the insinuation that my brother, my trusted brother, could be anything less than honorable. Then came the discovery, a gut punch that left me gasping for air. It wasn't a grand revelation, no dramatic confrontation in a lawyer's office. It was a dusty old ledger, hidden away in a forgotten attic box, a box I stumbled upon while cleaning out our mother's estate. This wasn't some ancient, indecipherable artifact. It was a financial record, meticulously kept by my grandfather, detailing every single asset, every property, every dollar that constituted the Vance family fortune. And as I cross-referenced it with the modern statements Arthur had so confidently provided, the numbers screamed at me. Discrepancies. Massive, undeniable discrepancies. The betrayal wasn't just a feeling, it was a cold, hard fact, etched in ink across aging paper. My blood ran cold. The man I had shared my childhood with, the man who had promised to protect our inheritance, had systematically siphoned off millions. Millions that belonged to our family, to my future, to the legacy my ancestors had worked tirelessly to build. The resentment I felt earlier transformed into something far more potent, far more dangerous, an all-consuming obsession. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Every waking moment was consumed by the ledger, by Arthur's lies, by the burning need to uncover the full extent of his deception. I had to know everything, every penny, every secret deal, every whispered conversation. The world had gone from dull gray to a vibrant, terrifying crimson. My focus narrowed, sharpening like a blade. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming not just what was stolen, but also the truth, the dignity, the very essence of what it meant to be a Vance. I became a detective in my own life, poring over documents, tracing transactions, digging into every corner of Arthur's carefully constructed empire. The more I unearthed, the deeper the wound of betrayal grew, but with it, a fierce, unyielding resolve. What I found next would not only shake my family to its core, but would expose a level of cunning and heartlessness I never thought possible. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated, decades-long scheme. And when I finally confronted Arthur, the man who had stolen not just my inheritance but my trust, the truth he had been hiding about our family, Fortune would explode, leaving no one unscathed. The question wasn't if he would pay, but how high the cost would be. And I was determined to collect every single penny. My name is Elias Vance, and my life, once a meticulously crafted illusion, shattered the day I discovered the truth about my family. For years, I believed I was living the American dream. A sprawling estate in the Hamptons, private schools, European vacations. It was all a carefully constructed facade, built on a foundation of lies and a fortune I never truly understood. I always thought my father, Arthur Vance, was a self-made man, a titan of industry who built his empire from nothing. He exuded an aura of unshakable confidence, a man who commanded respect and instilled a quiet fear in anyone who crossed him. I admired him, even revered him, though our relationship was always distant, formal, like a business arrangement rather than a father-son bond. My resentment began subtly, a slow burn that intensified with each passing year. Arthur was rarely present, always cloistered in his study or jetting off to some anonymous business meeting. My mother, Eleanor, a woman of exquisite taste and even more exquisite sadness, filled the void with endless shopping sprees and charity galas. She never spoke ill of Arthur, but her eyes held a perpetual melancholy, a silent accusation I couldn't decipher. I longed for a connection, a genuine moment of warmth from either of them, but it never came. My childhood was a gilded cage, beautiful yet empty, and I often felt like a carefully curated exhibit rather than a cherished son. The first crack in my perfect world appeared during my senior year of college. I was studying finance, eager to follow in Arthur's footsteps, to finally earn his approval. I stumbled upon an old ledger, hidden in a dusty box in the attic, tucked away behind my grandmother's forgotten photo albums. It wasn't just any ledger, it was my grandfather's, filled with cryptic entries and dates that predated Arthur's supposed rise to power. The handwriting was meticulous, almost artistic, detailing transactions I couldn't comprehend, involving shell corporations and offshore accounts. It felt like I was peering into a secret world, a world Arthur had deliberately kept hidden. I confronted him, not with the ledger itself, but with vague questions about his early career, trying to gauge his reaction. He dismissed my inquiries with a wave of his hand, his eyes hardening. "Some things are best left in the past, Elias," he said, his voice laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "Focus on your future, not on ancient history." His response, so dismissive and final, only fueled my suspicion. Why the secrecy? What was so damning about his past that he couldn't bear to discuss it? The resentment festered, turning into a gnawing curiosity, a need to uncover the truth he so desperately guarded. One evening, a few months after college graduation, I overheard a hushed conversation between Arthur, and that changed everything. His longtime legal counsel, Mr. Henderson. They were in Arthur's study, the door slightly ajar. Mr. Henderson's voice was low, urgent. "The Baines family is still asking questions, Arthur. After all these years, they haven't given up." Arthur's reply was sharp, almost a snarl. "Let them ask. There's nothing they can prove. Everything was handled perfectly." The name Baines struck me. It was a name I recognized from the old ledger, linked to a series of unusually large payments. The pieces began to click into place, forming a disturbing picture. The ledger, Arthur's evasiveness, the hushed conversation about the Baines family. It all pointed to something far more sinister than mere business dealings. I started digging, discreetly at first, poring over old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of the Baines family and their connection to my father. What I found sent a chill down my spine. A series of articles from 30 years ago detailed the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Baines, a brilliant inventor, and the subsequent hostile takeover of his burgeoning tech company by a then unknown entity. The timing aligned perfectly with the dates in my grandfather's ledger. My resentment transformed into something colder, sharper, a sense of betrayal. My entire life, my identity, was built on a lie. Arthur wasn't a self-made man. He was a man who had potentially built his fortune on the ruins of someone else's life, someone else's dream. The thought sickened me. I looked at the opulent mansion, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, and saw not wealth, but a monument to deceit. Elias Vance, the privileged son, was suddenly Elias Vance, the son of a potential thief, perhaps even worse. I started spending countless hours in the city's public library, away from the prying eyes of the estate staff, meticulously cross-referencing information. The internet provided a wealth of forgotten details. Thomas Baines had been on the cusp of a revolutionary breakthrough in renewable energy, a technology that would have changed the world. He had a wife, Sarah, and a young daughter, Lily, who were left with nothing after his disappearance. The articles painted a picture of a distraught family, desperate for answers, facing a powerful anonymous corporation that seemingly materialized overnight to seize Baines's assets. That corporation, I was beginning to suspect, was the foundation of the Vance empire. The more I uncovered, the more my anger solidified. It wasn't just about money. It was about a legacy, a life, stolen. The Baines family had been systematically erased, their tragedy buried under layers of legal maneuvering and corporate jargon. My father, the man I had once admired, now seemed like a ruthless predator. The luxury I had always taken for granted now felt tainted, a constant reminder of the injustice. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unlearn it. The world I knew had crumbled, revealing a dark, predatory underbelly. One evening, as I sat in my lavish bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of my privileged existence, a profound sense of isolation washed over me. I was alone in this discovery, unable to confide in anyone. My mother was too fragile, too steeped in her own silent sorrow. My friends, oblivious to the shadows lurking beneath the surface of my life, wouldn't understand. This burden was mine alone, and it was crushing. I looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror, seeing a stranger staring back, a man whose eyes now held a new dangerous glint. My focus shifted from understanding the past to actively seeking justice. This wasn't just about Arthur anymore. It was about the Baines family, about rectifying a decades-old wrong. I knew with chilling certainty that my life would never be the same. The quiet resentment had transformed into a burning need for answers, a thirst for retribution that would consume me. The cryptic entries in my grandfather's ledger became an obsession, a puzzle I was determined to solve. I spent countless nights poring over the faded script, cross-referencing dates, names, and what appeared to be coded transactions. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Arthur's narrative of self-made success was a carefully constructed lie. His empire hadn't been built from scratch. It had been acquired, piece by meticulous piece, from a legacy he had seemingly usurped. The ledger spoke of a lumber mill, a small but prosperous shipping company, and vast tracts of land along the coast, all properties that had once belonged to the Baines family. My blood ran cold as I recognized the name, the Baines family. They were a local legend, a pioneering family whose sudden, unexplained disappearance decades ago had been whispered about in hushed tones, a local mystery that had faded into folklore. I remembered hearing snippets as a child, hushed conversations among the older townspeople, always ending abruptly when I entered the room. They spoke of a devastating fire, a sudden bankruptcy, a family vanishing overnight. Arthur had always dismissed it as local gossip, a tragic but ultimately insignificant footnote in the town's history. Now the ledger painted a far more sinister picture. It detailed a series of aggressive financial maneuvers, predatory loans, and strategically timed bankruptcies that coincided precisely with the Baines family's downfall. The dates were undeniable, the connections irrefutable. Arthur hadn't built his fortune. He had systematically dismantled someone else's. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. The man I had admired, the titan I had strived to emulate, was a predator. The resentment I'd felt over his emotional absence now morphed into something far more potent, a searing sense of betrayal. It wasn't just his personal failings, it was the sheer audacity of his deception, the way he had built his entire life, and by extension, mine, on the ruins of another family's fortune. The gilded cage of my childhood now felt like a gilded prison, its bars forged from the stolen dreams of the Baines. My investigation moved from the dusty ledger to the digital realm. I spent weeks, then months, hunched over my laptop, sifting through public records, old newspaper archives, and obscure legal documents. I found the original deeds to the Baines properties, the loan agreements, the foreclosure notices, all bearing Arthur's signature, or the signature of shell corporations he secretly controlled. The intricate web of his deceit began to unravel, revealing a man who was not merely ambitious, but utterly ruthless. He had exploited every loophole, manipulated every legal technicality, and ultimately, ruined an entire family to build his own empire. The more I uncovered, the more the image of my father, the stoic, unyielding patriarch, shattered. In its place emerged a calculating opportunist, a man who saw people not as individuals, but as obstacles or stepping stones. The emotional distance I had always felt from Arthur now made chilling sense. How could a man capable of such cold-blooded maneuvering truly connect with anyone, even his own son? My mother's perpetual sadness, her quiet resignation, also began to resonate with a new, heartbreaking clarity. Had she known? Or had she, like me, been caught in the elaborate illusion Arthur had meticulously crafted? One evening, I found an old photograph tucked away in the very back of the ledger. It was a faded sepia image of a young couple, radiant with hope, standing in front of a sprawling lumber mill. Beneath it, in elegant script, were the names Thomas and Clara Baines. Their faces, full of life and promise, stared back at me, a stark contrast to the grim reality of their fate. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, followed by a surge of righteous anger. This wasn't just about money, it was about lives, about a legacy stolen, about the destruction of a family's future. The thirst for retribution that had begun as a dull ache now roared within me, a consuming fire. I knew then that I couldn't simply expose Arthur, I had to dismantle his empire, just as he had dismantled the Baines. I would use every ounce of the financial education he had unwittingly provided me to bring down the very edifice he had so ruthlessly constructed. This wasn't just about justice for the Baines family, it was about reclaiming my own identity, about purging the stain of his deceit from my life. I would not be another pawn in his twisted game. I would be the one to finally bring it to an end. The path ahead would be fraught with danger, I knew, but there was no turning back. The ghost of the Baines family and the burning betrayal in my own heart demanded action. The decision to dismantle Arthur's empire, to expose the rotten core of his legacy, felt less like a choice and more like an unavoidable current pulling me downstream. My initial rage had solidified into something colder, more calculating. I understood then that revenge wasn't a sudden explosion, but a meticulous, agonizing construction. The ledger, once a bewildering relic, became my blueprint. Its cryptic entries, once indecipherable, now whispered secrets, hinting at a labyrinthine network of shell corporations and offshore accounts. Each faded ink stroke was a clue, a breadcrumb leading me deeper into the true nature of Arthur Vance's wealth. I started with the easiest targets, the peripheral companies listed in the ledger that seemed to have no tangible assets, only endless paper trails. My finance background, once a tool to emulate Arthur, now served as a weapon against him. I spent countless nights hunched over my laptop, diving into corporate registries, unearthing obscure legal documents, and cross-referencing names that reappeared with unsettling frequency. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Arthur hadn't just inherited a small fortune, he had systematically, ruthlessly, absorbed it, dissolving legitimate businesses and funneling assets into his burgeoning empire. The Baines family, I discovered, was merely one of many whose livelihoods had been devoured by his insatiable ambition. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. a testament to a man utterly devoid of conscience. One name kept surfacing, a man named Sterling Thorne, listed as the director of several defunct companies that had once belonged to the Baines family. He was a ghost in the corporate world, his digital footprint almost non-existent. This man, I realized, was Arthur's shadow, the one who handled the dirty work, the legal sleight of hand that made the disappearances of these companies look legitimate. Finding Thorne became an obsession. I traced his last known address to a dilapidated apartment building in a forgotten corner of Queens, a stark contrast to the opulent world Arthur inhabited. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but I had to try. The air in Queens was thick with the smell of stale garbage and exhaust fumes, a world away from the manicured lawns of the Hamptons. The building was a concrete monolith, scarred by decades of neglect. Inside, the hallway reeked of mildew and desperation. I found Thorne's apartment on the 3rd floor, the door peeling and worn. I knocked, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. A shuffling sound from within, then a creak as the door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of a face, gaunt and suspicious. "Sterling Thorne?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. The man's eyes, bloodshot and wary, narrowed. "Who's asking?" he rasped, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. "Elias Vance," I replied, watching for a reaction. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear. "I believe you worked for my father, Arthur Vance." The door opened a little wider and I saw him fully. He was a shadow of a man, his clothes rumpled, his hair disheveled. The apartment behind him was dark, cluttered, filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. "Arthur Vance," he repeated, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. "What do you want with me?" "I want the truth," I said, stepping closer. "About the Baines family, about all of it." He hesitated, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape route. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, trying to close the door. But I put my foot out, stopping it. "Not long enough," I insisted, my voice hardening. "Not for the people who lost everything. Not for me. I know you were involved. I have the ledger." The mention of the ledger seemed to shatter his resolve. His shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, utterly broken. "Come in." He sighed, pushing the door open fully. The apartment was even more desolate than I imagined, filled with the stench of old cigarettes and regret. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through a grimy window. Thorne gestured vaguely to a worn armchair. "Arthur Vance," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "He was a monster." A genius, yes, but a monster nonetheless. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound weariness. "You have no idea what he was capable of." And in that dingy apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a wasted life, Sterling Thorne began to unravel the tapestry of Arthur Vance's darkest secrets, each thread a betrayal, each knot a stolen fortune. He spoke of shell companies dissolved overnight, of forged signatures, of intimidation tactics that would make lesser men crumble. He detailed how Arthur had systematically acquired the Baines family's land, leveraging their financial woes, then orchestrating a series of legal maneuvers that left them penniless and without recourse. Thorne himself, he confessed, had been coerced, threatened with ruin if he didn't comply. He was a victim, in his own way, caught in Arthur's web. Listening to him, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The ledger, my grandmother's melancholic gaze, my father's cold detachment, it all made sense. Arthur hadn't just built an empire, he had plundered one, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. My anger, once a raw, burning flame, transformed into a cold, precise instrument. Thorne's testimony was the missing link, the undeniable proof I needed. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was lost, it was about ensuring that Arthur Vance would finally face the consequences of his monster, Au's ambition. The path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. a sense of purpose that transcended mere revenge. I was on the cusp of something far greater. The anonymous email arrived late one night, a single, encrypted attachment. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked it open, the screen illuminating my darkened study. Inside, a meticulously detailed report outlined the full extent of Arthur Vance's financial machinations, not just the initial fraud, but a decades-long pattern of asset stripping, shell corporations, and offshore accounts designed to systematically bleed my grandfather's legitimate businesses dry. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, a testament to Arthur's chilling ambition and utter lack of conscience. This wasn't just about the initial takeover. It was a calculated, sustained campaign of theft, carefully disguised as shrewd business acumen. The report also contained something far more personal, something that twisted a fresh knife in my gut. It detailed how Arthur had systematically isolated my mother, Eleanor, from her family, controlling her access to information, even intercepting correspondence. He had painted my grandfather as a senile, incompetent businessman, convincing Eleanor that Arthur was her only protector, her only source of stability. It was a cruel, psychological game, designed to keep her dependent and oblivious. The perpetual melancholy in her eyes, the sadness I could never decipher, it suddenly made agonizing sense. She wasn't just grieving a lost inheritance. She was living a lie, trapped by a man who had stolen her past and controlled her present. A cold rage, unlike anything I had ever known, settled deep within me. It wasn't just about the money anymore, or even about justice for my grandfather. It was about Eleanor, about the years of quiet suffering she had endured under Arthur's manipulative thumb. He hadn't just stolen a fortune, he had stolen her life, her autonomy, her connection to her own family. The thought of confronting him, of tearing down his carefully constructed empire piece by piece, became an all-consuming fire. I spent weeks poring over the documents, cross-referencing dates, names, and transactions. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Arthur Vance was a master illusionist, and I was finally seeing behind the curtain. My first move was to quietly reach out to a forensic accountant, a man known for his discretion and his ability to unravel the most complex financial webs. I presented him with a sanitized version of the truth, enough to pique his interest without revealing the full extent of my personal vendetta. He was intrigued, his eyes gleaming with the challenge. He confirmed my suspicions, explaining the intricate legal loopholes Arthur had exploited, the layers of obfuscation designed to make discovery nearly impossible. He also warned me that Arthur was a formidable opponent, deeply entrenched in the legal and financial systems, with powerful allies who would protect him. This wasn't a game for the faint of heart, and the stakes were higher than I could have ever imagined. Arthur had built his fortress brick by brick, and I knew dismantling it would require precision, patience, and an unwavering resolve. I began to assemble my team, a small, trusted circle of experts who understood the delicate dance between law and vengeance. There was the seasoned private investigator, a ghost in the shadows, whose network of informants stretched across continents. There was the sharp-witted legal counsel, a young woman with a fierce intellect and an insatiable hunger for justice, who specialized in white-collar crime. Each person I brought on board understood the gravity of the situation, the immense power we were up against. The tension in our clandestine meetings was palpable. We worked in hushed tones, late into the night, dissecting every detail, anticipating Arthur's next move. I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. The closer we got, the more real the danger became. Arthur wasn't just a businessman, he was a predator, and I was about to expose his most closely guarded secrets. I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight, and that fight would be brutal. The thought of facing him, of stripping away his facade in front of the world, filled me with a terrifying anticipation. One evening, as I was reviewing some of the older documents, a detail caught my eye. A small, almost imperceptible discrepancy in a land deed signature dating back decades. It was my grandfather's signature, but something about the flourish was off, subtly different from other authenticated documents. My heart leaped. Could it be? I immediately sent it to a renowned handwriting expert. Days later, the call came. The expert confirmed my suspicions. The signature was a forgery, a masterful one, but a forgery nonetheless. This wasn't just about financial fraud. It was a criminal act, a direct falsification that could unravel everything Arthur had built. This was the missing piece, the undeniable proof that could shatter Arthur's carefully constructed world. It wasn't just a matter of civil litigation. This was a criminal offense, a direct challenge to his legitimacy. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur hadn't just been opportunistic. He had been criminal from the very beginning. The man I had once admired, the man who was my father, was a fraud, a thief, and a master manipulator. The layers of deceit ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. The forged signature was a golden key, unlocking a new avenue of attack, a way to hit Arthur where he was most vulnerable. It also meant the stakes were about to escalate dramatically. Arthur would fight back with everything he had, and I knew he possessed a ruthless streak that knew no bounds. My own safety and the safety of my team was now a very real concern. Yet there was no turning back. The path to justice, to reclaiming what was rightfully ours, was fraught with peril, but the fire of my resolve burned brighter than ever. I was ready for the storm. The storm arrived, not as a sudden tempest, but as a creeping fog that slowly enveloped Arthur's carefully constructed world. My legal team, a formidable assembly of sharp minds and even sharper tactics, moved with surgical precision. They unleashed a torrent of subpoenas, discovery motions, and public filings that painted a stark, unflattering picture of Arthur Vance, the self-made titan. Each document was a chisel, chipping away at the monument he had built to himself, revealing the rot beneath. The media, ever hungry for scandal, devoured it all, turning Arthur's once pristine image into a cautionary tale. I watched it unfold from a distance, a detached observer of my own meticulously orchestrated demolition. There was no joy in it, only a grim satisfaction that the truth, however ugly, was finally seeing the light. Arthur, true to my prediction, fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. His lawyers, a phalanx of high-priced attack dogs, launched countersuits, threatened defamation, and tried every trick in the book to discredit me and my team. They painted me as a disgruntled heir, a spoiled brat attempting to usurp his father's legacy out of spite. It was a predictable narrative, but it held little sway against the mountain of evidence we had amassed. The real battle, however, wasn't fought in courtrooms or newspaper headlines. It was fought in the quiet corners of Arthur's empire, in the boardrooms and executive suites where his power truly resided. My team systematically targeted his key investors, his business partners, and even his most loyal employees. We presented them with undeniable proof of his illicit dealings, his financial manipulations, and the blatant disregard he had for ethical conduct. The dominoes began to fall. First, a major investment firm pulled its backing, citing irreconcilable differences and reputational risk. Then, a long-standing business partner, a man who had stood by Arthur for decades, publicly severed ties. The whispers turned into shouts, the doubts into certainties. Arthur became a pariah in the very circles he had once dominated. I heard reports of his increasing isolation, his frantic attempts to shore up his crumbling empire. He was a man cornered, lashing out at everyone around him, his once impenetrable facade cracking under the immense pressure. I knew he was suffering, and a part of me, a small residual part that still remembered the boy who had once looked up to him, felt a flicker of something akin to pity. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by the memory of my grandfather's stolen legacy, of my mother's quiet despair, and of my own childhood, spent yearning for a father who was never truly there. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a whimper. It was a hushed, private meeting, arranged at the insistence of Arthur's remaining legal counsel. The room was stark, devoid of the usual trappings of power he surrounded himself with. Arthur sat across from me, a shadow of his former self. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes hollow, and the arrogance that had defined him for so long had been replaced by a weary resignation. He looked old, truly old, for the first time in my memory. "Elias," he began, his voice raspy, "this has gone far enough." I met his gaze unflinching. "It hasn't even begun, Arthur. Not until every last penny is accounted for and every wrong is righted." He sighed, a deep shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire crumbling empire. "What do you want?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. "Justice," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning within me. "For my grandfather, for my mother, for everyone you've exploited to build your gilded cage." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if steeling himself. When he opened them again, there was a flicker of something new in their depths. Not anger, not defiance, but a profound, almost heartbreaking weariness. "The ledger," he said, his voice barely audible. "You found it." I simply nodded. There was no need for further explanation. The ledger was the key, the irrefutable evidence that had brought his empire to its knees. "He never wanted me to have it," Arthur continued, his gaze distant, lost in some forgotten memory. "He always said I wasn't worthy, that I lacked integrity." A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He was right, of course. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. It wasn't an apology, not truly, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the impenetrable wall he had built around himself. It was the closest thing to a surrender I would ever get from him. The negotiations that followed were swift and brutal. My team laid out our demands, and Arthur, defeated and exposed, had little choice but to concede. The Vance fortune, meticulously tracked and catalogued, was to be redistributed. A significant portion would go to a foundation in my grandfather's name, dedicated to supporting ethical business practices and financial transparency. Another substantial amount would be set aside for my mother, ensuring her financial independence and a level of security she had never truly known. The rest, after covering legal fees and restitution to those Arthur had wronged, would be mine. It wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about the principle, about tearing down the edifice of deceit and rebuilding something honest from the ruins. As the final documents were signed, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. The battle was won, the central conflict resolved, but the victory felt hollow, tinged with a melancholy I hadn't anticipated. Arthur, stripped of his power and his fortune, was a broken man. And I, the architect of his downfall, was left with a legacy I had never truly wanted, a fortune stained by the very lies I had exposed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered, and a quiet, bittersweet peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered, and a quiet, bittersweet peace. Arthur, stripped of his power and his fortune, was a broken man. And I, the architect of his downfall, was left with a legacy I had never truly wanted, a fortune stained by the very lies I had exposed. The weight of what I had done settled heavily on me, a paradox of victory and emptiness. The empire Arthur built, or rather stole, was now mine, but its grandeur felt like a hollow echo in the vast, silent rooms of the Hamptons estate. I stood in Arthur's study, the very room where he had once held court, dictating destinies with a flick of his wrist. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, illuminating the countless framed photographs of him with dignitaries, celebrities, and even a former president. Each smile, each handshake, now seemed like a grotesque caricature of success. The man in those pictures, the titan I had once admired, was gone, replaced by a defeated figure I barely recognized. The satisfaction I thought I would feel, the triumphant rush of vindication, never arrived. Instead, a profound weariness settled deep in my bones. My mother, Eleanor, surprisingly, was the first to break the silence that had enveloped our lives. She approached me cautiously. Her eyes, once perpetually melancholic, now held a flicker of something new, a fragile hope, perhaps, or a newfound resolve. She spoke of her own regrets, of the choices she had made, or rather, the choices she had allowed Arthur to make for her. She confessed to a lifetime of quiet suffering, of being complicit in a facade that had suffocated her spirit. Her words, delivered in a soft, trembling voice, were not an apology, but an offering of truth, a raw unveiling of her own pain. It was a connection I had craved my entire life, finally offered in the aftermath of destruction. We began to sift through the wreckage of our past, not just the financial ruin, but the emotional debris that had accumulated over decades. There were long, difficult conversations, tears, and even moments of shared laughter as we unearthed forgotten memories, untainted by Arthur's shadow. I learned about her dreams, her aspirations before she met him, before she became Mrs. Arthur Vance, a gilded ornament in his carefully constructed world. It was a slow, arduous process, but with each shared story, each vulnerability exposed, the chasm between us began to narrow. The legal battles dragged on for months, a tedious dance of lawyers and paperwork. The public spectacle, the whispers, the scandal, it all faded into background noise. My focus shifted from retribution to reconstruction. I had inherited a fortune, yes, but also a responsibility. The people Arthur had wronged, the small businesses he had crushed, the families he had exploited, their stories echoed in my mind. The ledger, my grandfather's meticulous record of Arthur's early transgressions, became my guide, a roadmap to righting the wrongs. I established a foundation, quietly, without fanfare, dedicated to restitution and ethical business practices. It wasn't about public redemption, it was about honoring the memory of my grandfather, the man whose legacy Arthur had so ruthlessly usurped. It was about building something genuine, something that could withstand the scrutiny of truth. The wealth, once a symbol of deceit, slowly began to transform into a tool for genuine change. One afternoon I visited Arthur in the modest apartment he now occupied. He was a ghost of his former self, his once piercing eyes dulled, his shoulders slumped. There was no anger, no accusation in my heart, only a quiet understanding of the man he had become. He looked up when I entered, a flicker of recognition then, a profound weariness. We spoke for a long time, not about the past, not about the fortune, but about the burden of legacy, the choices that define a life. He confessed to a deep, gnawing regret, not for the money he had lost, but for the son he had never truly known. It wasn't an apology in the conventional sense, but a raw, unvarnished admission of his failures as a father. In that moment, the anger that had fueled my obsession for so long finally dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of release. The revenge I had sought, the justice I had craved, had not come from his downfall, but from my own capacity for forgiveness, for understanding. The path forward was clear, not defined by the shadows of the past, but by the light of a new beginning. The storm had indeed passed, and in its wake, a quiet, bittersweet peace had finally taken root. The legacy was no longer a burden, but a canvas, waiting for a story of my own making. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, every eye on me as I stood to deliver my statement. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drumbeat of the years of betrayal and the burning resentment that had fueled me. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming my name, my father's legacy, and the truth that had been buried under layers of deceit. I looked at Robert, his face a mask of feigned innocence, though I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. He'd orchestrated this elaborate charade for decades, making me believe I was the undeserving black sheep, while he secretly siphoned off my inheritance. The memory of my father's last words, "Trust no one but family," echoed in my mind, a cruel irony given Robert's treachery. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "My father, a man of integrity and vision, built a fortune from nothing. He believed in hard work, honesty, and family. He also believed in me. Yet, after his death, I was systematically cut out of the very company he intended for me to lead, my inheritance dwindling year after year, under the guise of poor investments and market downturns. I laid out the meticulously gathered evidence, the doctored financial statements, the shell corporations, the offshore accounts. Each piece was a nail in Robert's coffin, a testament to his calculated avarice. The courtroom gasped when I revealed the forged documents, proving Robert had manipulated my father's will, leaving me with a pittance while he controlled the vast majority of the family empire. The betrayal felt fresh again, a searing wound. My obsession with uncovering the truth had consumed me, driving me through countless sleepless nights, poring over old ledgers and legal documents. Now, standing here, it felt like the culmination of a lifetime of fighting for what was rightfully mine. Robert's lawyer, a slick, expensive man, tried to discredit me, painting me as a disgruntled relative with a vendetta. But the evidence was irrefutable. My own meticulous tracking of Robert's transactions, the anonymous tip from a former disgruntled employee, even the forensic audit I'd secretly commissioned. It all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The judge's gavel finally fell, the sound echoing with the weight of justice. Robert was found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. The family fortune, or what was left of it after his lavish spending and hidden accounts, was to be returned to me. He was also facing a substantial prison sentence. As I walked out of the courtroom, the flashes of cameras and the murmur of reporters were a dull roar. The sense of triumph was undeniable, a rush of vindication that coursed through my veins. I had won. I had finally achieved the justice I had so desperately sought. Yet a hollowness remained. The victory felt incomplete. The years of emotional turmoil, the fractured relationships, the sheer mental and financial cost of this battle, they had taken their toll. My father wasn't here to see this, to know his legacy had been restored. The family, once a source of comfort, was now irrevocably broken. I sat alone in my father's old study, the scent of aged leather and pipe tobacco still lingering. The framed photo of him, smiling, looked down at me. I had achieved justice, but at what cost? The fortune was mine again, but the years I spent consumed by anger and suspicion, the relationships I neglected, the peace of mind I sacrificed, those were losses that no amount of money could ever replace. I realized then that while I had won the war, the scars of the battle would forever remain. The bitterness had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. The fortune was a responsibility, not a trophy. My journey had taught me the true value of trust, the devastating impact of betrayal, and the profound, often bittersweet nature of true justice. I had found my closure, but it was a closure born of hard-won wisdom, a peace tinged with the lingering echoes of a past that could never be fully undone.